Good afternoon and evening to everybody. This is going to be the second session of CellPress's Inclusive Language Speaker Series. CellPress's Inclusive Language Speaker Series is here to bring together researchers of various perspectives to help inform our editors, employees, and eventually authors, hopefully making language of scientific publishing more accurate and inclusive. In this panel, we're going to be specifically addressing something of like an overlooked area of visual communication in science and publishing. So we have two amazing panelists today. We have Dr. Esmita Charani and Sabrina Ashwell. Our first panelist is Dr. Esmita Charani. Her list of accolades and degrees and accomplishments are many, but most recently she's an associate professor at the University of Cape Town, where she's doing a Wellcome Trust Career Development Fellowship investigating intersectionality in AMR through 2027. And she's here today to talk about her and her co-authors' research called The Use of Imagery in Global Health, an Analysis of Infectious Disease Documents and a Framework to Guide Practice. We here have all looked to this research and has sort of guided us in our attempts to kind of bring together Cell to create some cohesive guidelines to address these problems. And we believe that Esmita and her co-authors' work is a pretty amazing entry point into the problems we're facing, their impacts, and the potential framework for improvement. So Esmita has done us the service of pre-recording her panel. She is here in person to answer questions and deal with things, but her internet connection is a little unstable, so we decided this is kind of the safest way to go. So I will be kicking that off now. Hopefully we can all see this. Okay.
Good morning, good afternoon, wherever everybody is in the world. It's a pleasure to be joining this panel. I'm very grateful to the Cell and Lancet Global Health teams for giving us this opportunity. I'm Esmita Charani, and I'm going to be talking about the work that we did on imagery use in global health and the analysis that we undertook, particularly around infectious diseases documents and the framework we developed for ethical standards of representation of people in global health. I'm currently in a location where internet is very weak, so I have pre-recorded this call, but I am online, or I will be online to take questions and participate in the panel discussions that follow. So we did this piece of work. We were triggered by a specific event that occurred in relation to our work. So I teach and I do research in behavior change and antimicrobial stewardship in different countries. And I was invited by WHO Afro to give a talk to our East African colleagues on behavior change and antimicrobial stewardship with a colleague of mine, Winnie Nambatia from Uganda. And when we put together our slides, we sent it back to WHO, who said that they have to put their branding on the slides. And when the slides came back to us, these images were on them. And particularly the first image I found very troubling because, first of all, it's completely irrelevant to the subject matter. And secondly, as an outsider speaking to colleagues in East Africa, I felt very uncomfortable using this kind of imagery because I've given this talk in many locations around the world, for example, in Europe, and I've never used an image of a group of European women dancing to go to church to talk about behavior change and antimicrobial stewardship. We went back to the WHO and we requested that they remove these images because as the speaker, as the creator of the content, I didn't want this to be part of the work. And we were told that this is standard imagery that they use in global health and the images were not removed. And I presented this work at the time. I was teaching on an MSc in global health at Imperial College London, and I presented this to the medical students and we had a discussion and we decided to go away and collect evidence on how we currently use imagery in global health to understand and gather the data on what is problematic about our existing practices and what we need to change. We went in with assumptions that there is a difference in the way we represent people in different localities and geographies in the world, particularly in relation to low and middle income countries. And we felt that this is important because images are stories, and the stories that we choose to tell and the imagery that we use to accompany them tell us a lot about our prejudices, about our isms, and about the lens that we look at the world. And also it has the power to shape the lens through which others see the world. So we chose specifically to look at antimicrobial resistance and infectious diseases and vaccination because global health is so broad, and this happens to be our area of expertise. And we again assumed that we would find issues with relevance, integrity, consent, and representation, and we were not wrong. We found these to be true. We identified a visual framing of global health and antimicrobial resistance that is troubling, particularly in representation of women and children. Current practices speak to colonialism and othering of diseases. And they also reflect the policy agendas, interests of different actors who are operating in this space. Just as an example, these images at the top are from public-facing literature in high-income countries for a high-income country audience. And as you can see, they are actors, they're very staged, everybody looks very happy and sterile. Now, I worked in the National Health Service for 15 years, and I have never had to use an iPad. So also we depict an idealized version of the reality. But when we go to lower middle-income countries to depict situation and people, we use very raw images of vulnerable patients receiving healthcare. Now, the protection around the images of children, of course, we all know about, is very strict in the countries in which we operate. If I were to go to a hospital in the UK, and I have conducted years of clinical research that uses ethnography and documentation of how we practice and how we work, I was never allowed to take a photograph of a patient, a real patient in a real world for the purpose of my research, particularly of children. But when we go to lower and middle income countries, suddenly we drop our standards and we do things differently. So the aim of our work was to review the imagery of current use of imagery in public-facing grey literature related to infectious diseases and to deliver insights into how our current practices can be made more equitable, respectful, and relevant. The study design was that we conducted a search, particularly as I mentioned, in relation to vaccination and antimicrobial resistance of key actors operating within global health. And the inclusion criteria was that the documents that were reviewed had to be public-facing. They had to include at least one image of a human subject, and they should be published between 2015 and 2022. We chose 2015 because that was the year that the Global Action Plan for Antimicrobial Resistance was released by WHO, and there has been a steady stream of documents since then around this topic. And then we had to decide, how do we analyze this? We're no experts in this field. We did this from a place of frustration and that we were triggered to do this work. We looked at where there currently is guidelines, or there were guidelines around use of imagery, and we found Photographers Without Borders having some guidelines, Concord Code of Conduct on Images and Messages, and the National Press Photographers Association. And we used both qualitative and quantitative methods to analyze. Quantitatively, we provided descriptive statistics of the images, and qualitatively, we assessed the images for relevant, integrity, consent, and representation. And two reviewers analyzed each document and the images within independently of each other. To give a summary of the descriptive statistics, we included over 14 global health actors, gathering over 118 publications. Of these, 859 had images of human subjects. We identified an overrepresentation of people of color in the documents that we reviewed, an overrepresentation of children. Over 46% of documents had images of children. Of these, a staggering 91% were images of children in lower middle income countries. And then I'm just going to focus on two of the criteria we looked at, but we looked at specific criteria qualitatively, and we found, as I mentioned, problems across all of the criteria we included. When it came to representation and relevance, we found a lot of irrelevant use of imagery in relation to people who are from lower middle income countries, often have nothing to do with the subject matter, but the image of a child in Bangladesh or Pakistan or Eritrea or the Congo is used just randomly to depict a medical issue, for example, around antimicrobial resistance. And there's a tendency to overrepresent non-whites without clear link to health topic or contextualization of the image. Very few images actually told the story of the person being depicted. There were massive issues around integrity, as I touched on already, specifically of use of imagery of children in vulnerable situations where they are there to receive healthcare, not to be exploited for their condition. There were a lot of depictions of imagery of vulnerability that were gratuitous and failed to protect the dignity of the subjects, particularly when it was women and children from lower middle income countries. So we developed this framework to help guide practices so that when people go and want to use an image of a person or a group of people from a particular location to tell the story, they have a guidance as to what needs to be done. And we want these guidelines to be used to depict people regardless of geography, regardless of color, of gender. This is really important because images are a powerful tool and we want them to continue to be used to tell our stories. But what we're asking is that regardless of the location of the people whose story you are telling, you apply the same rules of respect, of dignity, of consent and representation. To carry on this conversation, of course, is really important. This framework is not a full stop. This is the beginning of a conversation, and we have further funding from the Wellcome Trust and University of Oxford Innovation and Decolonizing Global Health grants to evaluate this framework, to validate it, and to share it in different media with different groups. So we are very grateful for this opportunity in this panel. We are so encouraged by the publicity and attention this work has received. We have presented this work in news media in South Africa. We have written about this in different channels, in articles facing the general public. And we continue this conversation, particularly to ensure that we develop a mechanism for transparency around the use of imagery in global health towards a more equitable and accurate representation of individuals that serve to counter stereotypes. We were so happy to see the Lancet group of journals take this on and use this framework as a means to change their policy around how imagery is used, to revise their guidelines around use of images of people in relation to depicting issues around health and equity. And this is a wonderful step in the right direction. And we hope that other journals follow suit. But also we are open to critique. We want this framework to be developed further, to be built upon. If there are things we have missed, we are so happy for this conversation to carry on. And the reason why this work is important and this conversation is important is illustrated in this work that was published very recently last month in Lancet Global Health. In response to our framework, colleagues decided for a global health conference to use AI to generate images in global health, to steer away from the issues, the problematic practices that we described when we use images of human beings. And what we found is that the images that AI generates are far worse than images that we as human beings generate about each other and the stories that we tell. This first image is when the AI system was told to prompt to produce images of doctors helping children in Africa. The second image was about HIV patients receiving care, and the AI system could only come up with Black patients as HIV patients. The last image is, for me, the most powerful because the AI system was prompted to produce images of sick and poor white children, and it could only bring up images that look Victorian or Dickensian. So the AI system thinks that we have eradicated poverty and suffering in high-income countries. And we had a conversation about this with our colleagues, my courses, and we said, what about all the opioid crisis in the USA? What about so many other areas, pockets of inequality that are happening in high-income countries? And who are we doing a disservice by not being equitable in representation of inequity in the spaces and environments in which we work? This is a continuation of the conversation by the Lancet that was started around towards global health equity. We welcome validation of the framework and the further promotion of this, and for the framework to be used. But I think it's really important to understand that we need to speak to a wide group of audiences. We have to speak to people who recommission new images. We need to recommission new images, but we have to speak to the right audiences for that. We need to review the entire process from commissioning to briefing to fieldwork to archiving to ensure that we engage with comms teams of the large NGOs to be able to do justice to this work and to move forward. So the next steps for us are that we are working with EVOSA, which is a grassroots social justice organization in Cape Town, and they engage a lot with school children and train them in video documentaries and journalism. And we are giving a brief to the children that work with Evozo to develop a documentary about how they would like to be depicted. So because we have to also be very careful not to speak on behalf of people. We have to understand our own privileges as poets in this piece of work. This conversation needs to go to the people whose images we are representing, and we need to hear from people about how the people want to be represented with dignity whilst we still talk about the social issues that are causing the biggest impact in global health. This Cell Purse panel is a continuation of progress and conversation in this space, and we are so grateful to have been able to have an opportunity to contribute to this. And as I mentioned, we would welcome validation of this framework. So I hope the conversation we have in this panel discussion will move this conversation further forward. Thank you very much. These are my pauses, but also thank you to the editors of Lancet Global Health, particularly Zoe Mullen, for engaging with this work and giving us this very important platform to talk about this work. Thank you.
That was excellent and succinct. Thank you, Esmita. I will be, let's see if I can introduce. Sabrina Ashwell. So good morning, or I should say good afternoon, Sabrina. She is the senior copy editor of Chemical and Engineering News at the American Chemical Society. She chaired the team that created the ACS Inclusivity Style Guide and contributed to the guidelines on inclusive language and images in scholarly communication for the Coalition for Diversity, Inclusion, and Scholarly Communications. Sabrina is, luckily for us, a 2-for-1 panelist guest. Originally, when we were putting this panel together, we were hemming and hawing about whether to invite ACS or C4DISC first, because we admired both of their guidelines and think they're the best out there. And it turns out Sabrina was involved in one and shared the other. So we were hoping, Sabrina, that you could give us a brief presentation to kind of give us an overview of what went into creation and implementation of these guidelines.
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. All right, can everybody see that? Great, okay.
Yep, we can see.
Thank you. Okay, so as we was just introduced about me, but I'll just repeat it. I'm the senior copy editor at Chemical and Engineering News at the American Chemical Society. And I have two perspectives here. One is a contributor to C4DISC's guide, and one is chair of the ACS Inclusivity Style Guide, which is a guide on inclusive language and images. Before getting into my specific experiences, I wanted to get us all on the same page about what inclusive images are and why they're important. C4DISC's guide says, inclusive images intentionally include a variety of people and seek to portray people respectfully and disrupt stereotypes. So when starting to create guidelines for inclusive images at your organization, you want to come up with a definition that will work for you. Also think of your reasons for codifying the guidelines, as that will help guide the process for creating them and the content of the guidelines. So some reasons might include to be more welcoming, to be more accurate, to reach a wider audience, and to show a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm going to share my experience with two different sets of inclusive image guidelines, and I hope that can help you think through how you want to approach inclusive image guidelines. I'm going to start with C4DISC. Before writing the image guidelines, we had to define the scope. We realized that any discussion of images may also include accessibility concerns. But because accessibility also goes beyond considerations for images, that topic was made its own section. And data visualization is a related but separate topic. Our overall process was that one person did the research, another person wrote, and another edited. After the guidelines were written, they were also reviewed by contributors to C4DISC's guidelines, plus an external party. That division of labor works best when you have people with different skills. For example, some people are more comfortable doing research than writing. It also helps when the writer is familiar with some of the research, so they're not starting from scratch when they're trying to look through the notes of someone else. So for the research, we looked at general guides from other organizations. For example, the Urban Institute's Do No Harm Guide, Applying Equity Awareness and Data Visualization, and a post on Forum One about inclusive images, the Conscious Style Guide's list of resources, and Google's Inclusive Marketing Guide. Those were some of the resources that we looked at. We also looked at existing projects from scholarly communication. So ACS's Diversity and Inclusion Cover Art series and Wiley's External Facing Image Guidelines. Other resources included tools like the If-Then Gender Representation Toolkit, which can help people collect data on gender representation in images. And then we looked at a few guidance specific to certain populations, such as how to choose images about eating disorders or incarcerated people. Once we did the research, we had to distill it into themes and practical guidance that people in scholarly publishing can implement. We chose to focus on overarching ideas rather than do's and don'ts for specific situations, though we do mention some as examples. For example, not showing emaciated body parts for an eating disorder context. We wanted to instead encourage people to do research on their specific topic to avoid stereotypes. And for example, we pointed people to the Conscious Style Guide, which has more resources. And we encouraged people to ask questions that can help them recognize pitfalls, like stereotyped roles and positions of power. I'm now going to do a brief overview of the guidance themselves, the guidelines themselves. One is to show diversity in images. So you want to vary the characteristics shown, things like skin tone and gender expression, but also things like body size, hairstyle, hair texture, and disability, and varying the combinations so that you're not showing the same type of person over and over to illustrate something. You want to look at your entire portfolio of images because any one image can't show the full diversity of human experience. So you want to notice patterns of exclusion. You could consider auditing your images. For example, there are tools, like I mentioned, the If-Then Gender Representation Toolkit, which can be modified to other characteristics, or you can create your own kind of informal method of auditing your materials. An important point is to be genuine in the images you show. So you want to ensure you're not just being performative and not, for example, showing an image showing diversity in one prominent location, but nowhere else. And that kind of goes back to the portfolio approach. And you also want to pair the part of being genuine is pairing the guidelines with policies that enforce a commitment to inclusion, equity, and diversity. Avoiding stereotypes is another key guideline. The C4DISC guidelines have a set of questions to ask to help people evaluate images, like their positions, their roles, that sort of thing. Another guideline is to do no harm. We want to avoid images that may be triggering. For example, avoiding showing images of self-harm. I'm now going to move on to ACS's guidelines. Our overall process was to do research, write, review them, get feedback, and revise. We were helped in the research phase by a checklist that Chemical and Engineering News's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Respect Committee had created for people choosing art. It had questions to help people think about inclusion during the art selection process. So things like, who is the target audience of your story or campaign? And is that group appropriately reflected in these images or graphics? Like C4DISC's group, we did research on inclusive image guidelines. We did research on any type of image, including photos. So Photo Shelter and Authority Collective's The Photographer's Guide to Inclusive Photography was a helpful resource. There aren't too many formal guides though, so we did have to look at things like articles and things beyond formal guides. Unlike C4DISC, the same person, who is me, did research and wrote the guidelines. And that approach works best when you have people who are skilled in both research and writing. From my perspective, it was easier to write the guidelines once I had done the research because I was more familiar with the topic. In the writing phase, we organized the research into themes and wrote guidelines. Our approach was to provide general principles that can help people make informed decisions on their specific context. Our hope is the guidelines can be implemented by anyone in the production of images, people selecting art, creating art, and editing a story. For example, we give image banks so that people choosing images have help, and we have an entry on captions so that editors choosing text to go with images have guidance. Because our guide applies to everyone in ACS and beyond, we want it to be broad in scope. We knew we wanted to include accessibility as a separate section. We also recently released a section on data visualization. So I'm going to go through ACS's guidelines now, and they're similar to C4 discs with some different focuses. First, we note that seeking feedback from a diverse group of people is important, as is ensuring that a diverse group of people is involved in the art selection and creation process. So those are good foundations to start from before you even think about, a specific image. Similar to C4 disc, you want to show diversity in images when possible, but to do it in a thoughtful and intentional, not performative way. We want to avoid stereotypes, thinking about, again, people's positioning in the who's in the foreground, who's in the background, clothing. We want to be accurate. For example, any symbols or cultural items shown should be appropriate to the context. You want to think about the way you're editing images. For example, if you're cropping photos, are you doing it appropriately? Is anyone being left out who shouldn't be? Looking at the way you change colors, that should be not done in a way that promotes stereotypes. And then also looking at captions. Is anyone being left out? Are people named evenly? Or, for example, are women defined in their relation to men or in their family status, like wife, and others are not? I now wanted to move on to talk about tips for creating inclusive image guidelines. The first one is to start with a diverse team. Diverse perspectives make content better. C4 Disc had a group from all parts of scholarly publishing with global representation, and I think that gives the guide a good, well-rounded feel. You want to think about who your audience is. Are the guidelines going to be for internal use, external use, or both? If it's for internal, is it for people choosing art, creating art, or reviewing pages like editors? Next, think about your scope. Will the guidelines include things like accessibility and data visualization, or will those be separate guidelines? Are you going to include guidance on text accompanying images? What you want to do is identify what your specific needs are. If it's related to choosing images, then things like a list of image banks might be helpful. Or is it for reviewing images or another aspect? Then you want to choose a format. Are you going to use paragraphs like C4 Disc used? Entries with a background and recommendation like ACS? A checklist like Chemical and Engineering News? A set of questions to ask, or any combination of any format? And for example, in addition to the section on images that ACS has, we also have a tip sheet for images that gives like the high level tips that is kind of quicker to look at. So we kind of had two formats there. In thinking about your format, you want to know your audience and what will work best for them. You want it to make it easy to implement, because the best guidelines, if they're hard to find or hard to implement, they're not going to be very useful. So the format is important. Okay, once the guidelines are written, you want to get feedback to help you identify areas missed or anything that's unclear, and then revise. And that feedback revision process is really important to honing the guidelines to be the best they can be. You then want to let people know that the guidelines exist and teach them how to use them. For example, establish that people should be thinking about diversity and inclusion in images from the beginning of the process, as it's easier to change images at the start rather than realize after a page has been laid out that an image is problematic. Think about setting reminders to staff about the guidelines. At Chemical and Engineering News, we have a Slack reminder that periodically reminds staff where to find the diversity, equity, inclusion, and respect checklists. And as a copy editor, I point people to the ACS Inclusivity Style Guide when questions about inclusive language and images come up. For the next tip, I'm going to spend a bit of time on it. So just fair warning that we're going to be spending some time on this point because it's very important. I recommend creating a mechanism for reviewing images for inclusivity and for people to ask for and receive feedback on images. It should be a place where people can ask questions about images without judgment or fear of being shamed. This will help people put the inclusive image guidelines into practice. As an example, CNEN, Chemical and Engineering News, has a Slack channel for sensitivity reviews, where staff can post questions and give feedback on articles and images. It's helpful for this mechanism to exist in a culture that values continuous improvement and encourages giving and receiving feedback. So you want to set some ground rules that will make people feel comfortable in actually asking for feedback on images and raising questions. When you do ask for feedback, hopefully you'll get feedback from a diverse group of people, but you don't want to put people on the spot or tokenize them. So for example, if you have a question about a certain group of people that's portrayed in an image, you don't want to go to a specific employee who shares that identity and ask them. That would be kind of too much pressure and tokenizing. You want to instead create an open forum where people can volunteer to give feedback. And as an example, in that Slack channel, CNEN's DEIR committee has a group of volunteers who will give feedback on questions people post in the channel. You also want to create some ground rules to guide respectful discussion. You can say, for example, communicate with civility, but you want to define what that means in practice. What does that actually look like? And provide guidance on how to handle disagreements. As an example, in 2020, CNN had training in having difficult conversations. And I think that has served us well in knowing how to approach conversations about, tricky questions about the images we're including in our magazine. You want to also define how people should ask for feedback. Is it a post directly in something like Slack? Or are you going to create a Google Doc, like a cloud document where people can write comments and all in one place? Also think about what information people will need so that they can make informed decisions about an image that you're asking about. You also want to define who can ask for feedback and when. I'd encourage a culture in which anyone feels comfortable to raise a red flag and at any point in the process. And think about who has then the responsibility for posting this question. As a copy editor, I might suggest to the writer that they do it, or if I'm going to do it, I'll give them a heads up so that it doesn't come as a surprise when I'm asking a question about their language or image. And then once you create this mechanism, of course, you want to communicate about it so that everyone is aware it exists. In addition to feedback internally, you want to think about how to give feedback to authors about problematic images. One strategy is to focus on a common goal, such as clarity for the reader and inclusion. You might consider using templates for this type of feedback. I co-wrote a scholarly kitchen blog post about tips for wording inclusive language and image queries. I'll share the link at the end, but that can be a starting point if you're unsure of how to word these things. You also want to create a process for periodically reviewing and updating the guidelines. I'd recommend at least once a year. But you want to set up a structure ahead of time so that you're not scrambling, a year later to figure out how you're going to do it, who's responsible, the exact process. Both C4DISC and ACS have committed to updating their guidelines. And at ACS, I know we created an update document that outlines exactly the steps, who's going to do it, at what point in the year, who we're going to get feedback from for the updates and those sorts of considerations. So at the end of my presentation, I'll just share some links to C4DISC's overall guide and the image guidelines specifically. The ACS Inclusivity Style Guide and their image guidelines are here. You can also find it easily on Google, but and then the scholarly kitchen post that I mentioned. So I want to thank you for your attention today. Thank you for inviting me. Feel free to email me or find me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to answer any questions today.
I just want to thank both of our panelists here for taking the time to put together such, engaging and challenging presentations. I think we've all learned a lot here. I certainly have. And I'm really looking forward to diving in and putting these into practice to start creating our guidelines.